Alright, so this is the sign up form. Now we want to do the validation on the client side using JavaScript. What we have done in the previous 3-hour session in the add pizza form, we have done the validation here using PHP. So this is a back-end validation. So if you remember what we actually implemented, I'm just going to show you the code really quick. We've said that in the add.php we've had like a div that contains a paragraph which is essentially empty. It contains an associative array that is called errors. So that associative array that is called errors, it has the key of email and title and ingredients, and by default all of them are empty unless we do something that is not valid by submitting an empty form like this. So they start having values, the div starts to have values. So if I just refresh, let me just open that add pizza again, and let me just show you the form here. So the division is just, it has a paragraph that is empty. Once you hit submit, notice that this is going to have some value. Okay, so now it has the value, which is this message. You cannot leave this email empty. So that was the concept that we have used in the previous 3-hour session. So we are going to prepare an empty div by default, and this div is going to have an error message if there is something that is invalid that we have done, meaning that if we submitted an empty field like this, if we submitted something that is like an invalid email or an invalid here in the sign up. So let's see here in the sign up, no, that's just some browser stuff. So if we submitted a password that is not matching, then this is one error. If we submitted something like no input fields at all, no values at all, so this is going to raise an empty field error. Okay, so we're going to do the same trick here. I'm going to have an empty div after each input field. So let me just, alright, so I'm going to go to my signup.php, and as I've told you before, I don't want to write this sign up. If you didn't watch the restructuring and reallocating PHP code in specific PHP files like this, if you didn't watch that video, then what I will going to do is that instead of writing any PHP logic in the signup.php, I'm just going to write it in a folder in a partial PHP file that I'm going to include inside the signup.php. So instead of writing like 100 lines in the same script here, I'm just going to write these lines in another file and then include that file here, right? So this is what I've been doing in this includes folder right there, right? So I'm just going to create that signup partial file. So signup.sign up.inc.php, and I'm going to start my PHP, and I'm going to include my database. So include, what was it called, config, and db connect .php. Once I have the connection, it can just leave this so far. So this is so good. All right, and I think we just need that, right? So I'm just going to include that file, that partial file here in the signup page. So it is found inside the includes sign up, like that. So let's just refresh and make sure that things are working. Something is wrong, so let me just see. It's inc. Refresh and we're good. This is just something that is annoying. This is something in the browser. Alright. Alright, so cool. We are going to make a division, alright, and we've said that this division is going to be having a class of danger. If you don't remember what this danger class is, it is just a predefined class that I've just defined in the styles add. So if I went there, I think it was here, yeah. So the class danger that we give this div, it targets the paragraph inside that div with the class danger, and it puts any stuff inside that paragraph in color red, and it gives them these styles. That's it, right? So I'm just going to prepare that empty div, give it a class of danger, and then a paragraph, right? And this is it. I'm going to do the same thing after the email, after the password, and after the other password. Alright, now the main event here is that whenever we click on the button, we click on the submit button, or the button type submit, which is named as register here, right? So it's named as sign up and it has the value of register. Bottom line is that whenever we click on the submit type button, right, we want to check, are the fields in these input fields, are they having a value of none, are the values are empty. So if it's empty, we're going to show them the error is you cannot leave this field empty. So in order to trigger this kind of event is basically called on submit. You've seen before on click and on hover, so this is on submit, right? And in order to grab or to trigger that event, this event works on forms, so you need to grab the entire form. You need to grab the entire form or select the entire form, then do this event on it, which is the submit event, right? So I'm just going to grab that form. I'm just going to give that form a class. I'm going to call it, or an ID. I'm going to call it validate like that, right? So let me just make a JavaScript tag, and I'm going to write my stuff externally, and I'm going to call it form validation for sign up.js, and I'm going to have this in a folder called JavaScript, right? So everything is just structured correctly. So I'm just going to create a folder first. Okay, that was weird. Let's make a folder and call it JavaScript. We've made a folder. We've made already a folder that's called JavaScript. Yeah, we've made a folder that is called JavaScript, where we have taken every JavaScript we have added to the add pizza page, and we've included that content inside of it. Then we externally linked it in the script tag. So there is a folder called JavaScript. So I'm just going to create a file called form validation signup.javascript, right? So I think I've written sign wrong, but who cares, right? So I'm just going to go to the sign up page, and then I'm going to write my script. So first of all, let's grab this form. So I'm just going to grab it via the ID. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to do this in the browser, it's easier. Okay, so I'm going to have this to the right and go to the console, document.getElementById, grab the ID of validate, right? So here we have the form. I'm just going to store it in a variable called form, and I'm going to take everything and save it in this line. Now we have the form. Now we can perform the submit event, right? So I'm just going to say on this form I'm going to add an event listener. Add event listener. If you don't know what this is, please watch the JavaScript videos. So the event is called submit. So this is the name of the event. That's something predefined in JavaScript, right? If you want to know exactly what this is, you can just say on and see. You have all of these stuff. So on click, on change, and there is on submit. This is on submit. So it's the same stuff here. It's the same kind of event here, right? So whenever we submit, we want this callback function, this callback anonymous function to be executed. So whenever this is triggered, whenever we hit on the submit button on this form, this function, this callback function is going to be executed. So whatever we write in this callback function is going to be executed. So the first thing is that I want to grab the value. Let's try the first username. Let's try just the first input field, right? So I want to grab that username. So I can go like this. I can go and grab that input, which is the username, the first one here, by giving it an ID, just the same way we give an ID to the form. Or we can do something more nicer. So you can do the following. So you have document.getElementById, class name, and so on. There's something called getElementsByName, right? So let's try to grab element by name, and I'm going to give the name that is, notice that there is we have this name that is username, so I'm just going to pass username, and it's going to tell you we have found, this returns a list, right? So we just care about the first element, which is index of 0. So I'm going to say that I'm going to grab the first element, and here we have the first element without giving it an ID. So this is a nicer way of doing things, right? So I'm just going to grab the username. Okay, so I'm just going to take this, and in my JavaScript I'm just going to grab it. I'm just going to make this a global variable here. Okay, so I've just grabbed the username. Now I want to check if the username have a value or not. So you can grab the value so easily. If I have the username element, I can just say username.value, and this, by the time here, it doesn't have anything, so it's just going to return an empty string. So if I type something like that, and I just went to add username.value, so it's going to return the current value. So I can use this idea here, right? So I will just use username on that element that I've grabbed, which has the name of username. I will say username.value to grab the value, and I'm going to say something called trim. It's a method that actually trims if there's any extra white spaces. If there's a white space like this at the beginning, at the end, so it trims the white spaces at the beginning and the ends, the trailing and leading white spaces. So this is a good thing, and I'm going to save this in a variable called username. Alright, let's just write it. Username value. Right, so this is the value inside the username element that we have just grabbed. Alright, I hope this is clear to you. Alright, so just grab the value, whatever that value is. I've just stored it in a variable called username value. So here we start our logic. So if I'm just going to say this is the emptiness check. So this is the emptiness check. So I'm just going to say if, in my parentheses, if username value was equal to empty string, this means obviously that this is just an empty field, right? So we can do the following. If it's an empty field, first of all, what we can do, if you remember what we had in the add pizza, if it's an empty field, we have this outline, right? So if you look closely, you're going to see, if I go to the inspector, and let me just refresh, let me just refresh and go to this element. So it doesn't have any class by default, right? So let's submit, and notice this. Now it has a class of error input, right? So we have actually predefined as well. We have defined this error input class before. So if you look at the styles add.css, you're going to see that error info just adds a box shadow. So this is this light shadow that you're seeing, and a border color of red. Right, so this is the class that we need to attach to the input field, itself, which is the input field that has the class of username here, the input field that has the class of username. Alright, so this is the element that I want to attach that red outline to it. So this class that is called error input, I want to attach it to this username field whenever we find something, we find that the value inside this input field is empty. Okay, so I'm just going to say, first thing, if I found that the value inside that username tag or the username element is empty, I'm going to show, or I'm going to add the alert. So let's add the red outline. So the red outline is added via the input or the class that I've shown you before, which is called error input, right? So error input is defined in the style CSS. So if you remember the beginning of this video, we have actually taken all of the code or all of the CSS style rules which was inside the styles.add.css, and we have added it to the style sheet for the sign up page, right? So essentially in the sign up page you're going to see the same thing. I've just copied the styles from there and pasted it there, right? Alright, so this is the class that we need to attach to the actual username tag, right? So this is the first thing that I'm going to do. Now, if I know that this is the element that I'm talking about, which is the username, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to say class list, and then just add the class that is called error input. Alright, So this is the first thing. The second thing that I'm going to do is that I want to show the error message. So sorry about that. So the second thing that I want to do is show the error message, right? Now notice that this error message needs to be shown in the div, the empty div that I've included inside this paragraph, inside that empty div that I've included after this username, after this input field. Alright? So we need to grab that division. So one can do the following in order to give it some kind of text inside that paragraph. So we can do the following. We can give the ID, or the division, we can give the division an ID, right? And grab that division, all right? Or if you specifically want to add the inner text inside the paragraph, then you can just add an ID for that paragraph that you want to grab and then add an inner text inside of it, right? But if you did this, you're going to do the same thing for every paragraph inside every division like this, right? So instead of doing all of this, we can do something that is really, really interesting. So we can do the following, right? So let me show you this in the console first. So I'm just going to go to the console. Now we want to grab that. So if the inspector, if you see the inspector, you have the division after this input field, which is the username. So you want to grab that division, right? And then you want to grab that paragraph inside that division. So how can you do this? Well, basically, if you know the username, so I know the username here, right? So if I just write username, so you have this input field, right? If you are wondering where is this coming from, it's basically because we have defined this in our JavaScript file that we are including in our page. That's why the browser is able to find that there is a variable called username. That's why. That's it, right? But anyways, if you have the username, which is the input field, right? So username, you can do something like next element sibling. So next element sibling is essentially going to get you that division, which currently doesn't have anything, right? It does only have a paragraph that is empty, right? So we can say that I'm going to store that division inside a variable called div. So I have the division. So now I have the division, but what I really need from that division is the paragraph that is inside of it, right? So you can't do something like division.paragraph because paragraph is not a property. It's not something like a class or ID. It's not a property on the division. It's an element. And if you want to get another element that is inside an element, you can do multiple stuff. You can, if you want to grab a child, in other words, if you want to grab a child element in another element, so in this division, you can see that this division, it has a child element that is paragraph. So we want to get to that child, right? So there are multiple ways to do it. There is like child, there's children, and there's child nodes, and there's child element, right? So I will do something slightly different that is called first element child, right? So first element child, if you see this, is going to return to you whenever you click enter, is going to return the paragraph. So I'm just going to hit enter here. Now we have the paragraph that is inside the div that we have grabbed from the next element sibling after we had our username, right? So first element child just grabs the first child inside that division that we have grabbed from before, right? So I can do something like this. If I have the paragraph, I can just store it in a variable called b, right? Or I won't need to actually store it. If I know that this is the paragraph, I can do something like this. Inner text, or I'm not going to use inner HTML, so inner text, I'm going to place some stuff in it. Something like, you cannot leave this message field empty, right? And here you go, this is the message. So that's just the logic behind it. So the first thing that you need to do after we have the username, see, we have the username by its name, that's the input field. Now we can use the next element sibling to get the division that is right after it, right? And notice that this will work if you have the division right after the input, right? So if there is another, some kind of, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe there's a span, right? So there is another element after this input. Next sibling is not going to be working here, right? because the next sibling here is not going to be the division, it's going to be the span. So make sure that this layout is the same as my HTML page here, right? So I'm placing specifically this division after the first or after each input field so that the next element sibling can work smoothly. All right, so I'm just going to grab this and I'm going to store this in a variable called div, and if I know the div, if I grab the div, I can just grab the element inside of it using div first element child. I don't want to write everything, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. So first element child, now you have the paragraph, right? So if you have the paragraph, just use the inner text property in order to place whatever message that you want to place here. I'm just going to remove this comment here. So I will say you cannot leave this username field empty, right? So this is the second thing that we need to do. So let me just try this now. All right, and let's go to the sign up page. I should not have saved that route. Anyways, let me try to register and notice this. It happens really quickly, but it happens, it actually works. But it doesn't stay for this volatile thing here is happening because the event is just working really quickly, right? So we want to persist it, right? So it has some kind of a default behavior that whenever you click on the submit button, it just works for a part of the second, then it just goes away. So this is some kind of a default behavior with forms in JavaScript, right? So we can print that default behavior by just using something called print default. But the thing is that this default behavior is happening because of the event submit, right? So let me just rephrase. The submit event has a default behavior, right? And we want to prevent it in order to see this output actually appearing like this. Okay, so in order to see the output appearing, in order to see the output persistent, we need to remove the default behavior that the submit event of JavaScript has, right? So in order to do this, I know that this might sound a little bit weird, but actually this event that you are triggering here, or let's say that this event, if it is triggered, this function is going to be executed. Anything inside this function call or callback function is going to be executed, right? So what happens is that there is any callback function that you place in the second argument of any event listener has by default a first parameter that is called event, right? So actually the first parameter that is called event, it's an event, like it has an event argument. So any callback function, which is in the second argument of the add event listener method, they all have a first argument that represents the event, right? It doesn't necessarily needs to be named event. It can be named E, it can be named X, it can be named event or the event, right? No one cares. But by default, the first argument that you can place here in this callback function, right, in any event listener, by default, the first argument, always the first argument by default is called event. And notice that this is a default argument, since we actually, if we didn't place it, if we didn't put it inside this callback function, everything will run as you've seen, right? So everything will execute. There is no errors that you're going to see, right? But the thing is, if you want to prevent this, if you want to prevent some kind of an event behavior, so this submit button has an event behavior of just refreshing the page after you click on register. So that's why you don't see the output of this stuff that we have shown here being persistent on the page, right? If you want to prevent this, you need to provide that variable. So this default variable needs to be provided now, right? So as I told you, the first argument in the callback function of any event listener is an event argument, right? It's an event argument. It doesn't have to be called event. It can be called E, event, the event, whatever, but that doesn't change the fact that the first argument in any callback function to any event listener is an event argument, right? So knowing this, I'm just going to pass this event to this callback function, saying that if I clicked on submit on this form, I want you to execute this function body for me, right? And this function body, unfortunately, the effects that's going to be taking place in this couple of lines here is not going to be persistent, since the submit event by default, this event by default has a behavior of refreshing the page, right? So if you see this up close, so it's actually refreshing the page, so you don't really get to see what have been changed, right? So I'm saying that this event, which is called submit, I'm just going to pass it as an argument that is called event to this callback function, and I'm going to say if there was no value in the input field, this is the time, or this is the place where all of the changes happen, right? If this condition, if this logic of this if statement is true. So if this if statement is true, the changes, or these changes, should take place. And to make these changes persistent, we need to say that this event that I've passed to this callback function, I want to grab it and I want to say, please just prevent any default behavior that she has, right? So prevent default should do the trick. So let's just test this, and let me just go there. Oh my goodness, that's really annoying. All right, so now register. Let me just refresh. Okay, so register, and now the default behavior of refreshing the page after the event, the event's callback function is executed, right, is now gone. Now we don't have this refreshing behavior thing, so this is persistent. Now we need to do this for every field. We need to do this for the password, the username, for the email, for the first password, and the retyped password. Okay, so in order to make stuff a little bit modular, I'm going to place things in functions. I know that this might seem a little bit intimidating, but just stick with me. It's the same thing that we've been doing, but notice that this code is going to be really big, and this add event listener is going to be really huge when we cover the cases for the rest of the input fields. So I'm just want to make things as modular as possible and put things inside functions, right? So the first thing that I'm going to encapsulate is the following. I want to encapsulate adding grid outline. So I want to take this line and I want to put it in its own function. So I'm going to make a function that is called add grid outline, right? And I'm going to place this line. So the thing is that I want to add grid outline to any element that is not necessarily need to be the username. I want to add the red outline to this input field, which is the username input field, and the email input field, and the password input field. So essentially, any element that is passed to this function is going to have the red outline, is going to be having this class of error input that gives you the red outline, right? So this is the first encapsulating that we have done, right? So I'm just going to call this function instead of this line. Okay, but whenever you call, notice that this is just a parameter. This is the function definition, and in function definition you can just place a parameter of any name. It's not going to be any different. This is just a placeholder. What really matters is that when you call the function, you should pass the real deal. You should pass the real thing, and the real thing here is the username element that we have been using in place of this line just a couple of seconds ago. So instead of having this element, I'm going to pass the actual username input field that I want to add the red outline or the class that is error input to. Okay, so this is the first modular change. Now I will do the same stuff. Now this is showing the error message, so I'm just going to grab this and put them in a function, and I'm going to call this function show error error div, like this, show error div, right? And I'm going to place this line like that, right? But notice the same stuff. So show error div, this is the function definition. So I don't need to be specific in function definitions. I just need placeholders, right? So in the function definition, I want to grab any input field, whether it's the username input field, the email, the password. So this is essentially should be just any element, right? And just grab the next element right to it. So my design, my HTML design will work with this function definition for one reason. I have after every input field, I have a division. So this is going to work, right? If you change this, if you added an element in between the input field and the division, right, then you might run into some problems. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute. Okay, so once you have that division, I want to grab the first element out of it, which is the paragraph that is inside of it, and put the inner text which happens to be you cannot leave this username field empty. Notice something. This show error div should work for every input field. And now you should know that every input field should have its own error message. So this username input field, if it's empty, you're going to say you cannot leave this username empty. And if this is empty, you will say you cannot leave this email field empty. You cannot leave this password field empty. So the message here is something that you need to be supplying as well. It's not something static like this, right? It's something dynamic that you would need to supply. So I'm just going to have a placeholder for it in the function definition, right? And I'm just going to call the function now, and instead of these lines, I'm just going to paste this here, right? And I'm going to say that now show error division needs to have the element that is going to grab the division after it, right? So the element that I want to grab the division after it, it's going to be either this username input field, this email input field, whatever. So I'm just going to pass the same username that I've grabbed from earlier here, and I'm going to pass the actual message that is going to be placed into this message placeholder or parameter and sit as the inner text inside the paragraph inside the div, right? So this is the message here. So I'm just going to pass this guy right there, right? And actually I don't really need any of these lines anymore. So let's test this. It's going to be the same stuff, nothing is different. I'm just going to remove that here. Register, and you cannot leave this field empty. So it's the same stuff, but we've made stuff a little bit modular. Now we need to do the same thing for the email input field. So I need to grab the email input field, right? So I can just grab it using the same get element by name here, and the name, of course, I've named that input field as email. So I just can change this to email, and I'm going to change the variable name to email, like so, right? And I'm going to do the same thing, okay? So notice that this is going to be a little bit redundant. So I'm just going to have the same if statement. And notice that there is the first if statement is going to be having an else. So if the username value is not empty, so there's going to be an else here, right? And I'm going to have another if statement. So I'm just going to copy the whole block. So this is checking emptiness, username checking emptiness, username, like that. So all of this block is just for the username. Now imagine if you want to do the same stuff for every single input field. So I'm just going to copy this all over the place, and this is going to be email and so on. And this is not looking good. We can do much better, okay? So instead of copying this over and over and over again, notice the pattern here. So the pattern is this if and else block. So this block is going to be redundant. It's going to be repeating for the username value, for the email value, which we didn't actually do yet. So I'm just going to grab the email value, the same stuff that I've done before. So this is the, this is the email, and this is the email value, right? So I'm just going to say that this is for the email value, and here I'm going to send the email, and here I'm going to send the email. I'm going to say you cannot leave this email field empty. So notice the pattern here. It's the same if block, but now you are changing the username value to email value, and you're changing the input field that you're passing from username to the email field, right? So instead of like repeating this over and over again, you can just place all of this in a function, right? So I'm going to place this, I'm going to leave it just so you see what is the difference here. So let me just do this in a function. So I'm going to call this function check empty, since this function just check for if it's empty or not, right? So if it's empty, it does this. If it's not empty, There is another non-empty behavior that we are going to discuss in just a minute, but this is essentially the logic so far, right? So I'm going to make a function that is called check empty, like that, right? And I'm going to say that this check empty, it should essentially have the same stuff, right? It should have this the same things here. All right, but now we don't really want to say username value. It's just going to be the value of any input field passed. So we're just going to say any input field passed or any element passed, I want to grab its value and check if it's empty or not. So essentially this should be a parameter that is going to be passed to the function. That's one. The other thing, if that value of the element that is being sent, if the value was actually empty, now we want to grab the element that we have just grabbed its value. So this was username value, right? And now we want to grab the actual input field to give it a red outline, right? So let me just remind you, did I like cut the code? Yes, I've got the code, right? So let me just I'm going to leave the essential, the original code there so you understand what I'm just saying here, and I'm going to copy this. So again, now we have, after we grab the element, the input field username, we have grabbed its value and stored it in a variable relative to its name that is called username value, right? And what I want to make it look dynamic or feel dynamic is that instead of using the username value or email value or whatever element or input field value, I just want to make sure that this username value is just going to be any input field's element value. So instead of using username value, I'm just going to say any element value, right? So this is essentially, as we've said, this needs to be sent as a parameter to this function, as a placeholder. Now, if the element's value was empty, we want to grab the original element, the actual element, which is the one that we've selected from before, and give it a red outline, right? And select it again and pass it again to give it the error message inside its div, that has inside of it a paragraph, like we've seen before, right? So now we need the actual element, right? So now we need the actual element. So this is something that you are going to pass as well, right? So I'm going to pass the element and the value inside that element, and probably I would want to send the message, since this is actually was set on the username case. So you see that this is, you cannot leave this message or this username field empty, so this was set in the username case. If this is going to be an email, the message is going to be entirely different, and not entirely different, it's just going to be having an email instead of this username. But still, this is not going to be fixed or static like that, so I'm just going to say that this is going to be message, and this message is going to be passed as well, right? So I hope that you understand what just have been done. All right, so I'm just going to remove all of these comments. All right, and this essentially is the same exact number of code that we have written here, but instead of repeating this for the email value, for the password value, for the second password value, we can just use a function call to do that for us, right? So now I can call the function that is called check empty, and I can pass, first of all, we can pass the username, which is the element, and then the element value, which is the username value, and then pass the message here, which is you cannot leave this username field empty. And then we can use the same function again, function core, but this time for the email. So I'm just going to pass the email and then the email value, and you cannot leave this email field empty. So let's test this. There's one thing that is left. Now if you saw this function, right, I'm just going to indent this a little bit, right? Something is left here. This function, everything is known to it. So it knows that there's an element, since it's passed here in the header. It knows that there's an element value, since it's passed in the header. It knows that there is a message, since it's passed in the header of the function, right? So everything that is here is going to be familiar in this function body, except this event. So where does this function actually receive that event variable from? Nowhere, right? So we need to make sure that this function is inheriting or receiving that event argument from the event listener itself, from the function or from the callback function itself in the event listener, right? So I'm just going to add this at the end, like event, like this, right? So the check empty is going to be familiar with that event, since the callback function that the check empty function is being called inside if it, right, has an event. So the callback function has an event, the event argument. So I can just say that that event argument that the call function is having, I'm just going to pass it to check empty at the end here, right? So now the check empty can use that event that is being passed here inside of it, and it's going to be totally known to it, not a stranger variable, right? So this is it. So let's try and execute this. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry about that. All right, and refresh, and here you see you cannot leave this username empty, you cannot leave this email empty, and so far everything is looking good. But what happens if you actually entered something? Right, now we want to say that we want to take away this error. We want to take this error away, right? So let's see how can we do that. Or in other words, we need to undo whatever we have done, whatever error that we have shown, we need to hide it. Whatever red outline that we have added, we need to take it away. Okay.
And to do that, it's pretty simple. I'm just going to make the same functions, but the inverse of these functions. So if this is add red outline, so this should be remove red outline, right? So I'm just going to say this is going to be, that's the same, it's the same function, but I'm just going to say remove here, right? And show error div is going to be the same thing, hide error div. So if I was inserting any message, I'm just going to set the inner text by none, right? And in this case, this function wouldn't need another argument, it's just going to need the element, right? So if this is non-empty, we are going to do these functions. So this is going to be remove outline and hide error div, and here we are sending the element, right, that we are taking from there, and hide error div. So let's see if this works. Let's go to sign up and enter or just hit register. It's not gonna work. Now let's enter something. Oh, this needs to be an email, and it works. All right, now we need to make sure this is the first layer of validation, which is checking for emptiness, right? So it's not empty, and we made the check that it's not empty. What is left is that to make sure if that username, remember, if I just open my local host here and went to PHP my admin, you're going to see that the table had two unique values, right? It had the accounts, which is the ID. If I go to the structure here, you have the username and the email. These are two unique values, since the silver keys here, and this is the primary key. So we need to make sure that any value that's going to be entered there, it's not in the database. This username that I am willing to sign up with, it's not in the database, and the email is the same thing, right? So we have a bunch of emails and username that we can try. So we have this guy and this guy, so we're just going to try them, okay? And let's see. Okay, so the thing is, in order to do that, you need to use PHP for this part. You can't really use JavaScript in this part, because remember, the JavaScript that we're using is client-side JavaScript, meaning that this JavaScript is going to work for the front end only, right? So it's going to work for the front end, meaning that if there is something in the input fields that you are not satisfied with, some patterns, some emptiness, some white spaces, some characters, you want only alphabets, not alphanumeric, all of these can be handled with JavaScript in the front end. Okay, but whenever it comes to checking a value in the database, this is where the back end starts to kick in, right? So this is where PHP needs to be used. All right, so how can we make JavaScript and PHP work in conjunction? Well, remember what we have done in the add.php. If I went to the add.php, we have transferred the code into a partial PHP file that is called add include PHP. So I'm just going to go there. So validation using PHP. This is supposed to be using, but all right. Anyways, so validation using PHP was always related to submitting something, was related to a post request or a get request. A post request means that essentially you have a form, right? Let me just open up add.php. So a post request means that essentially you have a form, and this form have a method of post. And in order for this post to be triggered, and in order for this post method to be triggered, and in order for it to take all of the values from the input fields and send it back to the same page that we are in, you need to have a button that has the type of submit. So this is going to be triggering the post request in order to be sent and carry all of the values in the input fields and send it back to the action here, send it back to the same page that we're at, right? So once these values, which is supposed to be in the value key here, once these values are taken from the input fields, right, and you hit submit, the post method is going to take all of them and send it back to you to the beginning of the page, to the same page that you're in, add the PHP. So it's going to send it to the beginning of the page, which is it's going to be sent and handled by the PHP portion at the beginning of the page, right? Which is all of what we have done in the previous 3-hour session, right? So once these values are sent or submitted, right, we can check if these values are received by the sset function, if you remember this, right? So this is the whole situation in using PHP. So just to rephrase what I'm saying is that in order to let PHP actually catch the values from any input field, you need to have a form that contains these input fields. That's one. Second, this form needs to have a post method. That's two. Third, this form needs to have a submit type button in order for it to trigger the post method in that form, and the post method in that form is going to take all of the values of every input field, and send it back to the same page that we are at, which is the action, the destination. All right. So in order to do that, in order to use the backend or the PHP for the backend validation part, where we want to validate if the username exists in the database or not, right? We need to make sure that the value entered in the input, right? So if I entered something like this or this, these values are going to be saved in this variable value, right? So I want to take all of these values once they are set, right? Once they are non-empty, and send it to the database, and send these values first to the same page that we are at, right? And then make our query and go to the database and check is this value in the database, is this value in the database, and so on. Okay, so the question here is, when will PHP know that there is a value ready for it to take, right? When will PHP know that there is a value ready that it can catch from the input field? That's the whole question. Okay, so we can make some kind of an indicator. Okay, so I'm not going to write any code inside this partial file. I'm going to write all the code of the signup.php in the same script, but after I'm finished, I'm going to transfer everything to this partial file to make everything structured correctly. So I'm going to commit this out. So what I mean is that we can make something like this: set, right? And I'm going to check if the button that has the name of sign up has been clicked or set, like that. If it is set, if it is clicked, then please take the values that is inside every input field that has the name, for example, the username. So I'm going to take the first one, right? So let me take that variable that is called I'm going to save it in a variable called username, and I'm going to take the value from the input field that has the name of username. So I'm just going to say that from that submitted array, grab the value from the input field that has the name of username, like this, and just save it in my username variable. And I can start my query and say something like this, right? SQL equal select everything from the table that is called accounts. Let me just see here. I name it accounts, yeah. Where username, I have a table called or a column called username equal let me just have very big double quotes as wrappers here. Alright, where username equals, okay, where username equals that username. Now you can do something like this, and the same validation that we have done in the add.php. I'm not going to write the whole thing. I'm just going to copy and paste it in. All right. So when we're validating the email, we say that we are going to write a query, right? Which is the same thing, selecting everything from pizza, where email equals email, and query that or send that query using the query function, and check, does this return any values? If it returns any values, if this result has any values, has any rows greater than 0, then this means that the email already exists and this is an error, right? So I'm just going to do the same stuff here. Okay, so I'm just going to take this and write it there. Of course, the SQL query is different. We are working on our username, right? And this is, of course, an error, and this is a flag that username can be created, does not exist, and can be created. Okay, so we can try and complete this. We can make an echo here, or we can just make our usual error array. So I'm just going to say, notice that this we need the connection here, since the connection to the database was in this file and I committed it out. So I need the connection here. So I'm just going to make the connection. And remember, after we are done, we don't want to write all of the PHP code that is going to be relatively large in the same script. So I'm just going to cut it and put it in this file, in this partial PHP file. But anyways, let's just make the connection to DB. All right, include from config config add the DB connect like so .php, and here we go. This is the connection. Now we want to define our essential variables. Now the essential variables, we can also take it from there. It was like an error associative array and the actual values that we want to grab or catch from the input field. So we have a username here. We don't really have a title. We have an email that is going to be storing a key that is called email that is going to be storing the error value if there's a problem with the email, if it's in the database, etc. Right? And maybe we would need a password if there's an error. I don't think we are going to need that. We just need the username and the email, since these are the only things that we are checking in the database. But the password thing, right? The password thing is going to be checked via JavaScript on the client side. So that's why I don't really need to care about it in the PHP or the backend portion. I'm not going to check if the password is in the database. That's not a unique value that I care about here. What I only care about is the username and email. So I need to make sure that these are not in the database. So these are the only portions or parts that I'm going to prepare keys for in my error associative array. Alright, so this is going to be username. It's just initializing the variables, nothing new, email, and this is it. Alright, now let us try to see this. I'm going to show you what will happen here. Alright, so if the user hits and submit, in this submit button that has the name of sign up, we are going to take the username. I'm just going to try it in the username. Right, we're going to take the username, search for it in the database. If it was in the database greater than 0, then show an error. So I'm just going to show an error like that. So I'm just going to update the error associative array that has the key of username to something like username already exists. Alright, and this is it. Now else, this is what we are going to say if the username doesn't exist. And this is a good thing, the username can be used, so it can be created in the database. So you can just use an echo here and say something like valid username. So let's see how this is going to look like. All right. So let me just go to the sign up page and enter something that is not in this database. So something like um, Ahmad Gamal and register. So this has worked, but you need to write something here. So I'm just going to write something there and valid username. Okay, so notice that we have done both validations here. So the first validation is the JavaScript or the client-side validation. So this empty thing, this is coming from the validation that we've done inside this form validation JavaScript. All right, and the other validation is on the actual value. Is it in the database or not? So I'm just going to type an email, any email. We didn't do any PHP validation here. So we didn't make any check if this email is in the database or not. So we don't really care about this. I just want to write anything in this field, so it wouldn't tell me that you should write something. You should not leave this empty, right? So this is just a placeholder for now. And I'm going to write something that is inside the database. Let's see how it's going to be different. Well, notice that if it is inside the database, we will just update the error associative array under the key of username with that error message, but we never displayed it, right? We never displayed it, right? So we're going to display it in the same division, in the same div that was going to be supposedly to hold the error message. So this is going to be holding the error message from the JavaScript part using the inner text and stuff that we've seen from before, and also it should be able to handle any error message coming from the PHP itself. So I'm just going to echo whatever that is going to be inside the error associative array under the username. If this error is going to be only related if there is a username existing in the database. So let me just go and hit enter. So this is the JavaScript telling you that you should not leave this empty. I'm not going to leave this empty. This is just a placeholder, this email. Now this is what we are caring about. Now let me enter something that is inside the database, which is Omar Shendi, for example, and register. See, this is JavaScript telling you that now you have an error. This username exists in the database. All right. Now if I hit register, now this is JavaScript, so because you're leaving things empty. All right. But there is just one last point that we need to discuss. If you take a look at this part of the code, if I went to the JavaScript part, you see whenever there is a change happening, if we left something empty, right? So there is a default behavior that happens which like takes a split of a second to show that we didn't really like, so we prevented that default behavior, right? To make things persistent, meaning that if I went to the sign up and entered something, I will see everything persistent. Now, that's not the project that we were working on. I'm sorry, this is our project here, right? You would see that username and email will tell you.
Okay, so the user and email is going to tell you that you cannot leave this field empty. Okay, is it recording? Yes, it is. And once we hit write something, right? Once you type anything, so let me just type this username, which I happen to just enter right now, right? And another email, okay? So it's going to tell you that the username already exists, okay? So how did PHP know that there is a value? Well, this just happened because of how JavaScript is operating. So behind the scenes, JavaScript, whenever there is an event that is happening, so whenever there is an event that is, for example, the event submit that is happening on the form, meaning that if you click on submit, right, if you click on the submit on that form and this callback function happens to execute something, right, so it happens to execute something like this, right, to make some changes, to add some red outlines, to make some error divisions to appear, some messages to appear, right? So if you click on in this submit event and this callback function happen to execute something like that, right, then luckily JavaScript is going to just work as a wall, as a firewall between you and the backend. So PHP is not going to be listening to anything as long as JavaScript is running or executing its events here, its callback function on this event here, right? And the minute that there are no JavaScript executing, meaning that there is no empty strings, so all of this is not happening and the event is not really taking place, all right? So the values actually are there are actually some values. This is the minute that JavaScript will stop intervening, right? And PHP will take over. So the question that I've asked a couple of seconds ago or a couple of minutes ago, which was, how will PHP know that there is a value? Well, the first answer is depending on JavaScript's luck. All right, so we can luckily say that JavaScript is going to be intervening if there is something empty. All right, so as long as there's nothing empty, JavaScript is not going to be intervening in any sort of manner, and implicitly PHP will know that the values are there. It's going to know that there are values. Okay, so again, if JavaScript did not show any errors, if the validation, whenever you click on this submit, there was no empty strings, so the event didn't really occur, okay, meaning that you have entered some stuff, so JavaScript is not going to intervene. And if JavaScript didn't intervene, this means that the values, the fields definitely have a value. And this means that JavaScript is not going to work, so now it's time for PHP to shine. Okay, they cannot work in conjunction, like PHP and JavaScript on this button, because if you think of it, this button now has an event, a JavaScript event, and the same time in the back end it has the isSet function, it has the isSet in the PHP script here on the same button. So which one is going to win? Now there is an order, as I've mentioned. If there is no values at all, so there's no values at all, depending on the conditional here, the event is going to be triggered and the red outline and the error message is going to be appearing. Alright, but if there is a value in any of these fields, if there is a value, then JavaScript is not going to trigger any callback functions. It's not going to trigger any callback functions, so all of this is not going to happen, right? And PHP will take over whenever you click on this button. Okay, so the submit event on in the JavaScript client side is not going to work, but the isSet in the PHP backend on this button is going to work in this case. See, so it's either going to tell you that there is someone or the emails or the username is valid. Now, as a developer, you don't want to leave things for luck. You want to set conditionals for everything that is happening behind the scenes. Meaning that if I know that JavaScript is going to be working as the firewall or the gateway between PHP using this button or JavaScript using this button regarding of the values that you are going to be inserting or not inserting at all, by meaning that you will leave these fields empty, this is just depending on JavaScript's ability of handling things. And you don't want to depend entirely on some default behavior or some event in JavaScript or in any language whatsoever, because depending on default behaviors isn't how developers should think about programming or developing some website or any application. You need to have some solid logic, some solid conditionals that if this specifically was there, I'm going to do that. Right? So this is what I'm going to add. So just to reiterate, we can stick to this. You can just continue doing whatever you want to do, knowing that JavaScript is going to, the minute that you enter something, JavaScript is going to stop and PHP is going to take over, right? Okay, so this is the indicator for PHP that, like, that was the question from the beginning. How will PHP know that there is a value? How will PHP will get triggered? How will this isSet function is going to be triggered whenever you click on that button, right? How will it know that the values are not empty? How does it know is that there is a value in these input fields? Okay, so the answer is, you can, first of all, the first option, you can rely on JavaScript's default behavior, meaning that JavaScript, if JavaScript executed, then this means that there are empty fields. There are empty input fields, right? But if JavaScript didn't execute, then this is the main indicator to PHP that actually the user have entered some values. So there are values, right? So this is the time for PHP that it should catch these values from the input fields and just execute the query and send the values to the database to check if the username is there or if it's valid. Okay, so this is the first option, is to rely on JavaScript default behavior. So the question again, how will PHP know that there is a value inside the input fields? Well, option one that you can rely on, which what we have done so far, is that by saying that if JavaScript didn't execute, meaning that implicitly if you have entered anything, then this is the giveaway to PHP, then it can actually execute its set function. Okay, but that is, as I've mentioned, this is not good practice. You need to write your code, you need to write your logic by yourself, right? You don't really need to rely on some language or some event in other language to, if this, for example, this event triggered, then I know that PHP is not going to work. But if this event didn't trigger, meaning that you have some values here, then PHP is going to work hand to hand. Okay, so I can have this knowledge in my head, alright, but I can't always rely on it. So I'm going to write some logic to answer the question. This is the second option, which was the following: how will PHP know that there are values in the input fields, right? Or in other words, how will it know that the input fields are not empty? That's the real question. Okay, so to solve this, there are a couple of ways. I'm going to stick to something that is really easy. So I'm going to have a hidden input after each input. So after each input of these, I'm going to have a hidden input field. Alright, so let me just create that. So in the sign up page, I'm going to have an empty, a hidden input field that is not going to show anyway, and I'm going to give it the name of username valid. So this is like a flag for me, right? So what is this going to actually do is the following: if the values are entered in this input field, if JavaScript detected that this value was actually having some stuff, meaning that the value here is not empty, so it will grab that hidden input field and it's going to set the value in that hidden input field that has the name of, for example, username valid, is going to set its value to something like valid, right? And I'm going to catch, via PHP, I'm going to catch the value of that hidden input field. So if I catch that input field by its name, right, and I found that this hidden input field has a value of valid, then this is the time that I can actually take or catch the value from the input fields by PHP and send it in a query to the database. Okay, so this is going to work for me as a PHP indicator. This is the PHP flag or the PHP indicator. Then this is that it's telling you if this value became valid, then this is the giveaway, or this is the indicator that now it is the time to send to the database. Now you have some value in this input field. You have a value here, right? So if this hidden input field, again for the last time, if this hidden input field became valid, this means that the user entered something in the main input field. He entered something here, okay? And this is the time for PHP to take whatever value that the user have entered and take it and send it to the database. Okay? All right, so let's grab that element. Let's see how can we grab it. I'm going to grab it by the name, so I'm just going to open the console really quickly here and document.getElement by its name, and its name is username valid. So did I type something incorrectly? Maybe I need to refresh. Yes, we have it here. So this is the input field that is heading. It's not shown, but it's right after this input field, right? So I'm just going to take this guy and save it in my JavaScript file. So this is going to be I'm just going to say that this is um, to check if, or let's say if values were non-empty, meaning that the user entered something in them, notify JavaScript or notify PHP to catch these values by to catch these values, right? That's enough, right? By the following variables that I'm going to create. So I'm just going to save this one. Why did I copy this with me? In a variable that I'm going to call username valid. And notice that I didn't use the same username that has a hyphen. So I used the username or the name as username hyphen. But in variable naming conventions, you can't use that. A variable needs to have an underscore or no underscore, but you can't use hyphens, you can't use white spaces, and so on. Okay, so this is the element that I'm going to grab. Now I want to add some new part to this check empty. So I'm going to add another argument to this check empty. So the check empty is going to do a couple of stuff as you've seen from before. Right, it's going to take the username, it's going to take the check if there is a value, and if there is no values, and it's going to set that message, and I'm going to send that username valid element, which is the hidden input. Okay, so I'm not going to do that for the email, so I'm just going to try it for the first one, which is the username. Okay, so I'm just going to prepare a placeholder or parameter for it in the function definition. So this is going to be, it doesn't have to be username valid, by the way, it doesn't have to be the same name. Since this is just a parameter or a placeholder, it's going to be changed anywhere. So this can be for the username valid, email valid, password valid. So I'm just going to say that this is called, I'm going to call it PHP flag. This is, and by that I just mean that this is going to be like a flag to PHP. Something like, say, hey PHP, now this is, I'm raising you a flag that now this element, this hidden element, right, is having a value of valid. I'm going to remove that, right? So this element is having a value of valid, right? So this means that the value that is inside the main input field, which is the one that is shown to the user, has a value. So this is the time for you to catch that value and put it in a query and send it to the database if you want. Okay? So go back to the JavaScript. So this is the PHP flag. So if things went south and the user didn't enter anything, so he left everything empty, I'm going to grab that PHP flag, right, which is the username, here, this empty field here, this hidden field here. I'm going to grab it like that, this PHP flag, and say PHP flag, and I'm going to set its value to none. Right? But what happens if it was not empty? If it's not empty, then that field, this hidden input field, is going to be having a value of valid, and we are going to use that value in the PHP code in just a moment. Right? You're gonna see it right now. Okay, but let's just test that this is working. So let me just go to elements and take a look at that. So let's go to sign up. Now if I entered nothing, now the error message is not showing, because there's one slight issue that we've made. So if I went to the console here, let me just open the console from there, it's gonna tell you that it cannot read the property. So what is the problem? If we went to the line 40 in JavaScript, so this is line 4, alright, line 40 doesn't have anything, so let's check something else. It's in check empty, so let's see what check empty has. It's in show error division, so let's see show error division. Okay, so the problem is here. This lines here is not entirely correct. So anyways, so the problem is here. The problem is the following. Now we've said, remember the layout that we've made for our signup.php, remember the HTML layout? Now we've said that I don't really, if I want to grab the division that I want to insert the error message inside of it, this division, then I don't need to give it an ID like that. I can just, if I have already grabbed the element before of it, right? So like before we do this hidden input, our state was something like this before we add this line, right? So before we add this line, the state of the layout was something like that. If we grab the input field that is for the username or the email, we sequentially right after it added an adjacent division, right? And that's why this next element sibling worked, right? So instead of using division ID equals something and grabbing that division by ID, I'm just saying if I have the input field, I can just say next sibling. So this is the input field that we are passing to this show error message. See, this is the element that I'm passing to show error division. So this is the element that I'm passing to check empty, that I'm passing to the show error division. So the element here is username. Alright, so if I have the username, I can just use next element sibling and boom, you have the division. That would have worked before we added this line in between them, because now we have broken the structure. So next element sibling after that username is actually that input field. So it's not the division anymore. So what you're trying to do is that this hidden input field that you have grabbed, right, you want to get the first element child of it. And if you see this input field doesn't have something nested inside of it, it doesn't have a child inside of it, unlike this division, right, which happens to have a paragraph inside of it, right? So to solve this is really easy. So let me just grab that username and show you the solution here. So I'm just going to grab the username that we are using the next sibling on, and let me just go to console, and this is our username, right? So this is username. Okay, so if you did something like next element sibling, it's not going to get you the division, because as we've said, we've changed the layout. Now the division is not directly after the input field, which has the username name, right? So in order to get the division, we just need to chain one more next element sibling. So it's going to bypass the next element sibling, and it's going to get the second next element sibling. Alright, so this is going to get you the division. Alright, okay. So this is just the solution for that. It's just a very slight modification. So I'm just going to say like this, and this should do the trick. So let me just refresh and try to hit, and it didn't quite work. So did we do something wrong? Alright, let me just... Alright guys, so be cautious, because XAMPP is used to have this annoying thing. So if you traverse to this file, right, open this file in the browser, okay, and go to your check empty function that we have written, notice that we have written stuff in the else here. So let me just go to the things. We have written stuff in the else, but it's not really listening to it. So if something like this happened, just close XAMPP, close the Apache, stop the Apache and MySQL servers, and restart them again, and open them in another browser. So I just opened this in Chrome, and here you go, it works and it listens to it, so the error appears. Okay, so let's continue modularizing our code. So as we've modularized the added red outline and show error message, I'm going to do the same thing for this PHP value, or this PHP flag element, which is basically the hidden input that we are passing, to set it either to empty string or to set it to valid, since this is the indicator. If this is valid, PHP is going to grab it and it's going to perform stuff accordingly. That's the conditional, that if this value of the hidden input field were valid, now this is the time to grab the actual username input field, or the actual input email input field, or password input field, and grab the values, put it in a query, and send it to the database. So I'm going to make a function. I'm going to call it make invalid, and all it's going to do is grab the element, which is going to be the PHP flag, or the hidden input that is under my main input, right? And it's going to take it, set its value to none. So I'm just going to call this function here, and instead of this line, I'm going to send the PHP flag, right? And this is it. So I don't really need that line anymore. I'm going to do the same thing in the case of if things were actually working good, so I'm just going to stack it here. So I'm going to make, just to make things readable, I'm going to make this section functions to execute if things were or if values were empty, and the same thing here for the rest of these functions if values were non-empty. So I'm just going to call this make valid, which is going to set the value of valid, right, to this hidden input field. So this is going to be taking the value of valid in this hidden input field. This is an indicator to tell PHP now if this hidden input field is having the value of valid, now this means that this value in the main input field is having something here, so you catch it and put it in a query and send it to the database. Alright, so I'm just going to call make valid and send the PHP flag, which is the hidden input field, and I don't need this line anymore. Alright, so let me do the same thing. I can now comment out that email, but I will need to do the same stuff. So I will need a hidden input field under the email, like so. So I'm just going to give it the name of email valid, right? And I will need the same echo in case, since the email is going to be having a unique value, so you need to make sure that it does not exist in the database, same like before, right? And let's grab that valid. Why did I have a log here? So I'm just going to have email like that. Alright, and I'm going to send here email valid. Alright, and let's see how this is going to work. So let's go. There's one last thing that we need to make sure of. In our PHP code we needed to modify some stuff. So now that's the main event here. Alright, so we were asking ourselves, how will PHP know that there are values in the input fields, in the main input fields here, this and this and that, right? So that was the main question, right? So the answer to that is the conditional that we are going to put right now, right? So we will have an if statement to let PHP take control only if the username or any main input field, the username, the email, the password are not empty. Okay, so the default was if you wrote anything and you hit register, JavaScript by default is going to back down, it's going to back off, right? It's not going to take control. It is going to let PHP do whatever it wants. So the submit event is going to be losing its power the minute that we actually type something, and now PHP is going to take control by default automatically. Okay, so we want to make this happen on our desire, not by the desire of the built-in functions, because we are the programmers and we need to know exactly what kind of control are we implementing. So if there is a bug that happens anywhere in the code, we know what is the issue, what is the cause of it. So we're not relying on any default behavior. Okay, so now we want to say, if I just open this here, what I want to say now is that once we type something, all right, if you look at the JavaScript code, once you type something, of course the outline is going to be removed, the error message underneath is going to be removed, and what's really important is that the hidden input field under each one, the hidden input field under the email and the username, right, this one and this one, they are going to be having the value of valid here and the value of valid there. All right, so using this make valid here. So the minute that this happens, the minute that these hidden input fields are going to be having the value of valid here, and where is the second one? We've put another hidden input field after the email, but I think we need to refresh for this to happen. Yeah, and this for this value, for this hidden input field to have the value of valid. Once they have the value of valid, this means that we have written something, and this means that this is the time to let PHP manually to control and catch these values and put them in whatever query that we will write. So what I'm just going to modify in this code is the condition that I was mentioning, which is simply this. I'm just going to say if empty, I'm going to use the function empty. So from my post array, right, from my post array, if the value inside that hidden input field, which if we're talking about the case of the username first, so if the value inside that hidden input field, which happen to have the name of username valid, right, so if the value of that hidden input field was not empty, if it was not empty, meaning that this is having something, it had, JavaScript has injected the word valid here, right? So if it has something, I'm just going to close the braces here. So if it has something, now this is the time to perform our main PHP logic. So this is the time to say, all right, if it has something, now grab the main input field that is having the name of username, grab the main input field's value, grab the value that is here, because this actually means if it's not empty, so if the hidden input field value is not empty, this means that the value in the main input field, which is the username, is not empty. Okay, so if this is not empty, if it has the value of valid, you can just type it like that if you want to. So you can just use, if you don't want to use that empty, you can just use something like this. So if it equals to valid, right, so it's the same thing, right, but I'm going to use not empty. So anyways, if this is having the value of valid or whatever value that we are going to set via JavaScript, then this means that the main input field is having some value there. So if you don't remember, this is what we mean. If the input field, the main input field is not empty, the else is going to execute. So once the else is going to execute, the PHP flag, which is the hidden input field that we are sending to this function, right, is going to be taken over, and we are going to inject in its value field this value which is valid, or it can be anything, since we are just checking for if it was not empty or not. If we're not just saying that it's equal to valid, right? So if it's not empty, if the hidden input field value is not empty, this means that the main input field, which has the name of username, is not empty as well, and this is an indicator for me to take that value, put it in a query, and do whatever I want to do. So let's test that. Okay, so let's go to sign up, and first of all let's try the empty things. All right, now let's type something. Let me just type anything here and hit register, and notice this. Did you see that? This is the hidden input field, and this means this hidden input field that is under the username is having the value of valid, and this is my way as a programmer of telling PHP to take over control. So JavaScript has done its part, and the value here is there. The value in this main input field is existent. There is a value here. Where is this? Where is the value field? I can't see the value field. Anyways, the value field is there. There is a value under this key here. Okay, so I'm just via JavaScript, I'm indicating to PHP that the hidden input field is having the value of valid. So now it's time for you to take whatever value inside this input field and put it in a query, do whatever you want in the back end. Alright, I hope this is clear to you. And the same thing will happen with the email. So if I entered something, let's just make it an email. Alright, and hit register. So it's going to work. It's going to tell me valid username. All right, and so let's continue and perform the same if statement on our email. So this was username non-existence check or existence check. So validation. And the same thing here, I'm going to make it for the email. And note that the point of this if statement to check if non-empty. So if non-empty, right, which is going to be discovered by the hidden input fields value. If it's value, or if it's if it's valid, or just an empty string. Okay. So if it's valid, this is going to be executed. So I'm just going to copy the same thing here So this is the email. No. And I'm going to grab the hidden input field that I've placed under the email, and then I'm going to grab the email's main input field. I'm going to search by the email, right? And this is supposed to be an email, and I think this is it, but we are just going to modify the email error if the email already exists. Alright, and I'm going to have a BR there. So let's try that. Okay, so let's, first of all, this is not gonna work. Now let's try an email that is inside my database. So I'm just going to try, or a username that is inside my database. So I'm just going to try and here a .com, and let's try this. The username already exists and the email already exists. Alright, and if you entered something correctly and the other wasn't, it's just going to tell you that there is an error in one and there is no error in the other. So let's try something that is not there at all, and let's try an email that was already there and register. So the problem is with the email. Now what we want to persist, so it's going to tell you that valid username, but the other weren't valid. So let me just write something that is completely valid, meaning that they are, it's not completely valid, but they are not in the database. So you have valid username. Did I forget to change that? So yeah, valid email. But anyways, what we want to do is that we want to persist the value, meaning that if I enter something incorrect, like something that is inside the database, right, I want it to persist. Alright, this is going to be a little bit annoying, but anyways, I want it to persist. I want to see the value that was wrong here. Alright, so in order to do that, it's really easy. I just will grab that input field and I'm going to echo whatever is inside the username. So whatever is inside the username, and the same thing here, whatever is inside the email. And we need to initialize these variables. We have already initialized them. Alright, so instead of echoing if something were correct, if they are valid username, I'm just going to use flags the way that we have done in the previous 3-hour session, and the email valid, and I'm going to set both of them to false. Alright, and there's going to be password, but we're not going to do that yet. So here I'm just going to say username valid true, and the same thing here, email valid true, and once all of them are true, we're going to insert into the database. So let's continue with the password thing. Alright, so let's continue with the password. Now the PHP or the backend validation that we have done so far is in the username and the email, and this is the only backend validation that you need, right? We don't really need PHP to validate anything anymore. What's going to be done via PHP after this point is just catching the values from the password and the one of these, since this is just like a password and a retyped password, so grabbing the value from an input field of this one or this one is not going to be any different, since they should be equally the same. So this equality check is going to be done via JavaScript's validation, which is the client side of the front end JavaScript validation. Okay, so backend validation, we're done and just doing the username and the email, because that's the only things, these are the only fields which I happen to declare as unique in my database or my table. That's why I wanted to grab them and do some double checking if they are existent or not. All right, but the password, they can be whatever, they can be the same from any value of the database, since anyways, if you looked at this is going to be hashed. This is going to be a hashed password to begin with, so we don't really care about if it's going to be the same or not, since essentially it's not going to be the same, right? So if I just open the accounts, it's going to be hashed anyways, right? So let's do the empty errors using JavaScript on these passwords here. So I'm just going to do the same stuff. Let me just go to the JavaScript, and let me just remember what was the password input field's name. So we named this password 1 and password 2, and we had a division of an error division after each one of them. This is cool. what we really want to do is the following. We want to have a hidden input field after these two, so after the second one. All right. I just thought about doing something before I continue. Remember the next sibling element that we have chained twice, since we added an element in the middle between the main input field and the division error here in JavaScript. We've chained this twice since we want, after the input field, we want to skip the hidden input and go to the division, right? I'm just going to go back like and just redo this, right? So I'm just going to have the division right after the input field, like this. I think this is going to be easier, right? And I'm going to have one only chaining of the next element sibling. So after the input field, I will just find the division right afterwards. So I think this is better. Yeah, I'm going to do the same thing here, and that's it. So this shouldn't be any different. So I'm just going to check this. Yeah, it's not going to be any different. So let me just open the developer tools and expand this and write something valid here, and I'll leave this empty and hit register, and see here the hidden input field for the username is valid, and the error message for the email that is empty is showing, and it's just the same. So let's continue. Yeah, so we can do the same for the password. So I'm just going to grab the password first, the first and the second. I think I gave them the name of password 1 and 2. Okay, and yeah, so let's just grab this password 1, password 2, and I'm going to give them the same names. Okay, and I'm going to leave the hidden input of them just for a minute. Okay, so I'm just going to grab their values. So password 1 and password 2, and this is password 1 value, and this is password 2 value. All right, and let's do this. You can leave this password field empty, and I'm going to send the hidden input field. Let's have a hidden input field as well for the passwords, but I'm going to have the hidden input field after both of them, right? Essentially after the second one, because if you think of it, when is the time for you to tell PHP, now this is your time to grab the password value? Well, I'm going, as a PHP language, or as a PHP running in the back end, I will grab the password value from, not from the first one, but from the retyped password, from the second one, because if this was matching to this one, then this means that essentially both of them are correct, but I'm going to go for the second, I'm going to go for the later one, and I'm going to grab the value from it. So I'm going to have the hidden input field after the second password, right? And this is just a design decision that I made. You don't need to go with the same stuff here. All right, so I'm going to have the hidden input field. I'm going to name it password valid, and I'm gonna take this placeholder since it's hidden anyway. Okay, so I'm going to grab this guy by its name. So let me just copy this and take this away and grab this guy's element. So this is password valid, and I'm going to pass that password valid to both of them. Essentially, I'm not going to need it for the first one. This is the first one. I'm not going to need it. I'm not going to use the hidden password input on the first one, but I'm going to use it on the second one after I check that the second one is equal to the first one. Okay, so you can't, I'm just going to name this differently. Retype the password, please. So this is going to be password 1 value, and this is the password 1 element, this is the password 2 element, and this is the password 2 value. Alright, now let's see the logic here. Okay, so if they were empty, then it's the same thing. So we don't really need to change this. It should work, right? If it's not empty, this is where we actually we want to start checking the other layer of validation, or is the first password is equal to the retyped one or not. But let's just check that the empty check is working, or the empty validation is working, and here you go, it is working, right? So now we should play in the next layer. So here, if it's not empty, what do we do? If it's not empty, so we need to check. This is the first validation, right? So it's not empty, we need to check, is it a password field or an other, or is it a password type of input field or an other one, right? So if it is not a password, then we can clearly say that this is not empty and remove the outline and hide the error message and make the hidden input field under the username and under the email actually having a value of valid, since or to make PHP able to grab these values and make whatever kind of processing or checking or validation that it wants to make, right? So I'm just going to make sure that is the element that we are grabbing, is it have the type of something else than password? Notice that I'm talking about any input field type of text or email, anything other than password, right? So anything other than password, then we're good to go, right? So remove any errors, any red outline, make the hidden input field under each one is ready or valid, just to make PHP take control or grab the values on the spot, and so on, right? Else, this is where we start talking about the validation. So else, this means that it is a password type, right? So what we want to do is the following. Let's check, is the element that I'm grabbing, is it the second password or the first password, right? So if the element that I'm having in this function, is it the first or the second? So if you look at this function, here you're grabbing the first, right? And here you're grabbing the second, or the retyped. So I just want to make sure that if you were passing the second, right? So if, let's say for the second element, for the second password, which is called the retyped, right? If it's a retyped, right? So by this point, you know that nothing is going to be empty. By this point, you are inside the else, which is non-empty else. So by this point, nothing is empty. So there are values in each one of these, in each of the elements, right? What we want to check is the value in the first password field equal to the value inside the second password field or not? So this else means that nothing is empty. This if statement is saying, well, are these non-empty fields, are there passwords or not? If they're not passwords and they are non-empty, then my validation is done. I don't really need to show any red outlines or error messages for the email input field and the username or text input field, right? But if they were passwords, our job is not done with these passwords. We might run into other problems if the first password is not equal to the retype. So I'm going to say, is the element that I'm grabbing, I know that in this else, this means that the element that I have, it's a password, whether it's the first one or the second. What I want to do first is that if the element that I'm grabbing is the second password, which is the retype, I want to do the following, right? I want to check for equality, right? Check for equality, right? And I'm going to do a very simple function to check for equality, right? Password validation, right? So I'm going to make a function. I'm going to call it check equal, right? And I'm going to have a value, any value, and a second value, and I'm going to let it return true only if the first value was equal to the second value, right? So this it's as simple as that. The value, if the values that I'm sending were equal, this is going to be substituted with true. If the values that I'm sending this was not equal to that, then this is going to be substituted by false. right? So whatever this function is going to be returning, this is going to be my condition in the if statement. So if check equal, when I send the password, first of all I want to make sure that I'm grabbing the second password, right? Before of this I want to be sure or positive that I'm grabbing the second password. So if this was the second password, I'm going to say the following: for if element that I'm grabbing, if it is name, if it has a name that is equal to password 2, right? So this is password 2, this is the retyped password. So if it has the name of the retyped password, which is password 2, let me just, I don't think that the okay, so this is the closing of this else statement. Alright, what is this closing? This is the very big else, and this is closing the function. No, that's correct, that's correct. Okay, alright. So if we have been, this else mean that definitely this is one of the password fields, right? Now let's check, is it the second, right? So is it the second? I'm just going to have this here beside this so is it the second password? If it's the second password, the retyped, then I would want to check the equality, right? Alright, so I want to check the equality. So if the first password, notice that the password elements, I have declared them as global, right? I have declared the first password, which has the name of password 1, and the second password has the name of password 2 as global to begin with. So they are not inside any functions, and that was the point of having them as globals. So I'm just going to say, if the element that I'm passing happened to have the name of password 2, so this means that I am inside the retyped password now. Now let's make sure that the retyped password value is equal to the first password value. So I'm just going to say, if password1.value was equal to, no, there's no equal, I'm just going to pass them to the check equal function. If it's equal to password2.value, right, like that, then we have passed all the validation layers. So we have passed the non-emptiness, and we have passed the equality check, right? So this is time to remove all the error aspects and set the hidden input field to be ready, and by ready I mean to set its value to be valid, right? So that PHP in the back end will grab its value. So this is the indicator for the PHP. So I'm just going to apply everything for any valid stuff. So I'm just going to remove any outline on that retype password, right? Alright, remove outline, make valid, it's the same stuff, alright? And notice that I'm passing the PHP flag here, which is basically the password valid input, hidden input field here. Okay. Alright, and this is it. We need to continue that. Alright, so this if statements mean that they are equal. But what if they weren't equal? So this else for that. So not equal, then this is the time to produce another error. So I'm just going to go to the error segment here from above, and I'm going to say, the same thing: add red outline, show error division, and make invalid for the hidden input field. Alright, but what really matters here is that if I use the message that I've sent from before, so see if the element that I was checking empty happened to be the password that has the name of password 2. So we have sent a message that is called retype the password please. So this message is going to be appearing inside this else. I'm okay with this message appearing if if they were empty. So if things were empty, if the password, if this field was empty, so just show this message. But if we reach to this part, then this means obviously that this message is not going to be updated. That's not the updated message that I want to show. In this part, this means that they are not equal. So here I'm going to statically write this. So I'm just going to say retyped password need to be matching the first password field, or just write whatever message that you want to write. Alright, so let me just place things together. So let's just go through this. So this else, let me just see where does it close. So this is the closing of this else. Okay, so this else mean that, or let's go to the very bigger else. Right, so this is the very big else here. This is the closing tag for it. Right, so the big else mean that they are non-empty. So if the value that is non-empty was one of the email or the password, since they are non-empty, then I'm ready to remove any error messages on them and set them to be ready. They are non-empty, so the hidden input fields under them, which I'm talking about the email field or the username field, the hidden input fields under them needs to be ready. They need to have the value of valid, so PHP can take them and do whatever it wants with them, right? All right, so they are non-empty, and they should be all. This is where my green. This is the green light here. So they are non-empty. So if they were not passwords, so I'm going to remove any error messages or any error red outlines. But if they were non-empty and they were the type of password, so this else is going to be executing, right? So they were passwords, non-empty. They have values, but they are not. They are non-empty. So they have values, but they are passwords. So we need to make sure, since we have two double checks. If you notice that if you had in your system only one password, then you wouldn't go through all of this. So you wouldn't need even this if statement. So we would just go through our like normal system, right? So you would just have this inside the else, and there is no this if, there is no any of these things here if you only had one input field as a password. But since I have two, things are going to be a little bit complicated, as you're seeing here, right? So again, they're non-empty, they have values, right? What if they were non-empty and they have values, but they happen to be passwords? This else. So if they were passwords and they are non-empty, check the second one here. So if the second one, right, if the element that I'm grabbing now was the second input field, which is the second password input field, now check, is that second input field value equal to the first input field value? If they does, then they are in the green spot and everything is fine. So remove any errors and let the hidden input field for the password that we have placed here to be having the value of valid, set it to be ready, so PHP can grab whatever value is inside this guy, right? The last input field, password input field. Okay, if it wasn't, if they weren't equal to each other, then we are still in the red zone. So show an error, and this error this time needs to be different than the one passed here, right? So this error needs to be something related to equality check. So tell them that the retyped is not equal to the first entered password, right? So this was if the element, right? So non-empty, they are passwords, but what we are checking is in the second password field, right? So this is there. What if since they are password, this else means that they are passwords. What if it was the first password? So this else means that the fields are of course non-empty, that's one. Secondly, they are one of the passwords, one of the password fields. And third and finally, it is the first password field. So first password field, it's non-empty, it's a password, and definitely it has a value. So if it has a value, then remember all of this validation was supposed to be checking the emptiness. So it has a value and it's the first input field, so just this is the green zone for the first password. So remove anything regarding this element, right? And notice that we are not going to set any hidden input fields for that one. The first one doesn't really set the hidden input field, right? We set the second, or we set the hidden input field, which actually indicates to PHP that the value inside one of these passwords are ready to be grabbed, right? If the second retyped password was ready. All right. So if this was the first password field, we can't really say that the hidden is going to be valid. The hidden is going to be having the value of valid, since this is not how I'm going to tell PHP to grab the value, right? That's not the punchline. So we need to wait. Since both of them need to be ready. Now, if the second password was actually equal to the first one, set this to be valid, as you've seen here. So if they're equal, set this to be valid. But what if the first one was just non-empty? It had a value. No, that's not enough to make the hidden input field as valid. So I'm just going to comment this out. Alright, so let's check this and go to sign up, and hopefully there are no errors in the console. So I'm just going to grab this to the left, and empty values works. Now enter something in the password 1234. Now it's going to tell you, see this? This is the last else that we have made. This is the last else. The last else means that the first input field is not empty. So just go ahead and remove any errors around it. Remove the red outline, remove the error message, just as you're seeing here. But they are not equal. So it's going to tell you that the retype message needs to be matching. Notice that when we were just submitting empty field, the message was retype the password please, but not matching like that. So needs to be matching first. What if they were matching? Then we're good. Nothing is going to be shown anywhere, right? And I think that the I don't know, but yeah, you're gonna see that the hidden input field, if both of them were valid, the second one, the retyped, is going to be the one that controls the hidden input field to have the value of valid. Okay, so this, as you're seeing here, is valid. So if this was not matching, this is not going to be having any value of valid, the hidden input field. If this was matching, see, it's going to be having the value of valid here. Okay, the hidden input field underneath. Okay, so let's write this in our, let's write the back-end logic to insert stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly here, this is the if statement, that's this one, so I'm just going to grab this, and now existent validation, no, we just need to grab the password, that's all. Okay, so I'm going to prepare a variable for the password, and I'm going to prepare a variable for if it is ready or not, password valid, like so. Alright, okay, and I'm going to say if empty, I'm going to check the hidden input field for the password. So the hidden input field, which was called password valid with a hyphen. So notice this, the hidden input field was called password input field. So if this had a value inside its value attribute, so if this had a value, then this is the time for us, this is the indicator to grab the val in password field, input field. So I'm just going to say that inside that password that I've created, now grab the password from the password input field, and notice that I'm going to grab the value from the second password input field that has the name of password 2. Alright, and once we have this, we can just set the password valid to true, and this is it. One last thing before I forget, I just want to show you how can we hash the password. It's really easy using a built-in function called password hash. So I'm going to call this password hash function. I'm going to pass the password that I've grabbed from the input field, and I'm going to pass another argument called password default. and that's something in PHP. This means that it's going to check what is the current hashing algorithm that PHP uses in this version of PHP that you've installed when you were installing XAMPP, and it's going to grab that algorithm and use it to hash your password for you, and it's going to return a new hashed password that we can insert into the database, right? So don't worry about how to dehash it. I'm going to show you how to dehash it if you want to log in, since you wouldn't need to log in with the hashed password. No one will remember that. No one should even know about it, right? So if I entered in the input field 123, it's going to be hashed to some weird characters, right? And it's going to be stored in the database in that way. But whenever we log in, we want to log in with the same 123. So we want to dehash this from the database. I'm going to show you how can we do that, right? It's so easy. But anyways, this function returns the hashed variable, our hashed password value. So I'm just going to store it in a new variable that I'm going to call hashed pass. And I'm going to initialize that hash pass as well, like that. And once we are ready, I think we've done everything we can do. Now this is the time to insert into the database. So insert to DB. So I'm just going to say here that if all of them were available, if password were valid and email was valid, I don't think that this was a capital letter, and what was it, the username was valid. If everything is valid, now set the query to be select or insert into the table that is called accounts, and I'm going to insert under the username. These are the name of the column and the password, or email first then password, the following values, which are going to be, first of all is going to be the username, and the second is going to be the email, and the third is going to be the hashed password. Alright, and this is it. Now MySQLi query, send that query. Alright, I think it takes the connection first. Alright, so if things were smooth, if we've signed up correctly, this is the sign up mechanism, by the way, you just insert it to the database. So then we are going to redirect to login. So I'm just going to say header and take me to the login page, so login.php. Okay, else if there is a problem, then just display, let me just echo first, so display what is wrong, so MySQLi error, and send the connection. Alright, so hopefully let's cross our hands or see if this is going to work. So let me just see the database here to enter something that is not there. Okay, so let's enter something like Heidi Mort, and the email is going to be heidi@gmail.com, the password 123. We have checked the validation, we know that the validation is working, so I'm just going to fast forward through this. Now there is no login.php. Didn't we make one? Anyways, we're going to check that. I don't think that, yeah, we didn't create a login.php, but let's just go to the database and refresh, and I hope alhamdulillah we have the username here, the email here, and the hashed password here. Okay, so this sign up is working. Now we need to prepare our login page. One last thing before I finish this video, as I've told you, I want to have our files to be structured correctly. So I'm just going to grab all of the PHP code that are written here and paste it in a file, in a partial PHP file that I'm going to include inside this sign up page, right? So it's not going to be any different. So I'm just going to say that I'm going to call it signup.included.php. I already have something called that. Alright, that's cool. Yeah, I created it at the beginning, but I didn't really use it, and I'm going to paste all of the logic that we have been coding or writing inside the signup.php, inside this partial PHP script, right? And this script has the connection inside of it, so we can just remove that connection from there. And now we can comment out that include sign up, and if we refresh, let's just refresh, and let me just go there and create a sign up page so we don't really get, or the login page so we don't really get that error. Okay, so let's just go back and go to the sign up, do something like Kareem Magdi at gmail.com 123 sign up, and refresh, and we have this guy here, so everything is the same.